Everyone to our RuCCS colloquium. Today I'm really pleased to introduce Ailis Cournane from NYU Linguistics, where she's the creator of the Child Language Lab at NYU. Ailis earned an MA and PhD in linguistics from the University of Toronto, and before joining NYU also worked at the University of Mannheim in Germany. Her research focuses on how young children learn to linguistically express and understand modal concepts in a variety of languages. So far, a real variety: English, Bosnian, Dutch, French, German, Mandarin, and Spanish. It's a nice collection.
Not much in Spanish, really, but I don't know how that got on there.
Well, it's there now, so.
Okay, a little.
Study Spanish.
Yeah, good.
So today, Alicia is going to tell us about how preschool-aged children understand words like can and have to. So welcome to RuCCS, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andre, and thank you for having me. I've had a great day so far, and I'm sure that will continue. All right, so word learning challenges and children's behaviors with modals. So we're going to start with just a behavioral question. Good. How do preschool children behave on tasks testing modal force? So that is the distinction between modals like could, may, can, and might, which express possibilities, and versus necessity modals like have to, must, should, or got to, which express necessities. So how do kids do on these tasks where you test their comprehension of can or their comprehension of have to? So I'm going to illustrate with some kind of, there's several studies that have looked at this since the early 80s. I'm going to focus on some more recent ones and kind of talk about some broad findings that we found for these. So Ozturk and Papafragou 2014 sets up these scenarios with boxes. We love boxes for testing modal understanding. And most importantly are these two conditions. So in the possibility condition, you hide this little toy cow when the curtains are drawn. It's in one of two hiding spots, so either the yellow or the purple box. And the question is, where's the cow? And then the experimenter either says the cow may be in the yellow box or the cow has to be in the yellow box. And the question, of course, is if we're targeting the yellow box here, with a possibility modal, what do kids do? Do they say yes or no? And with a necessity modal, what do they do? Say yes or no. And then in a necessity scenario, you have the same hiding event behind the curtains. You hide the animal, you open the curtains, but then you open one of the boxes and reveal that it's empty. So you've only left one position, right? So that's the necessity situation. Again, test people either on possibility modals, the cow may be in the green box, or the cow has to be in the green box. Okay, so this is a good example stimuli. And we've had two major results coming out of this body of literature. Result one, is that preschoolers over-accept possibility modals in necessity scenarios. So in a necessity scenario where you've ruled out one of the hiding spots and you have just one remaining place where the cow can be, and you hear the cow may be in the green box, adults often reject this because it's under-informative. It's too weak a thing to say. You could have said have to. But kids are very happy with this, so they accept this. Possibility modals are in fact logically true in these necessity scenarios. Yes, it can be. In fact, it has to be. But they're pragmatically under-informative. So this common result, when children do this, when they over-accept the possibility modals, is usually understood as they don't generate the scalar implicature. They accept some as logically true, and they don't understand as some versus have to, right? Some not have to, but in fact, indeed, you have to be in there, right? However, that was an early finding, and it's sometimes still found. However, the scenario matters, and adults very often do this too. So in the Ozturk and Papafragou results, 5-year-olds accept may in necessity scenarios 86% of the time, and adults accept it at ceiling, right? So this is not, you often hear like kids are pragmatically not very good, and I'm actually not going to focus on this result, so we're taking a second here. But in fact, when you make sure to run adults on the same studies, you find often adults also don't worry about the underinformativity or potential underinformativity there. Result number 2 is the one we're going to focus on. Result number 2 from the literature, the prior literature, is that preschoolers also over-accept necessity modals in possibility scenarios. So here we have the scenario where we have the 2 hiding spots, so 2 open possibilities for where the cow would be. The participant here is the cow has to be in the yellow box. And what happens? Kids say yes to this. Kids say yes to this about half of the time in Ozturk and Papafragou. This behavior is much more surprising. It doesn't have a story relying on the scalar implicatures and the pragmatics. This is actually logically false, right? So it's not true that the cow has to be in the yellow box. Adults uniformly reject this. So this is true in the Ozturk and Papafragou results. So 5-year-olds are basically at chance. Clarification question?
Yeah,
yes.
Clarification. So in this paradigm, the experimenter is the one who says
yes.
It must be, and like the subject is aware that the experimenter doesn't know the answer.
Yes, they don't explicitly address that in the setup, but yes, in this particular study, the experimenter gives the results, and it should be that the experimenter is kind of not seeing behind the curtains when they're doing the hiding event, right? So you can trust that they don't know. Yeah. And adults here never accept, so adults always say no in this case. Okay, so what explains result 2? Over-accepting necessity modals in possibility scenarios. So the most common story in this line of literature is a conceptual difficulty with maintaining open possibilities. This is often called premature closure. So the idea is that when you're in this scenario, you have 2 possible hiding spots. You know, just not talking about the linguistics yet, you know the cow is in one of them. So you just pick one, you eliminate one, and you do that randomly. You just kind of randomly guess and commit to the guess. That's called premature closure because you have difficulty maintaining the possibilities, so you rule one out. And that is going to render have to true half of the time. Because imagine you toss out the yellow box, then if the sentence targets the yellow box, you say no, because it's not the one you committed to. If you tossed out the purple box and the sentence targets the yellow box, you committed to the yellow box, so have to is true. So this means at the population level, you're going to get 50-50. Importantly, they don't report, and I haven't been able to get the data, whether that is a 50-50 within participants or between. But this is their story, so I assume it's within. Okay, another possibility is another explanation is another conceptual one that's slightly different, and this is a conceptual inability to represent modal possibilities. So in this case, it's not that you can do it, but you can't maintain it, so you throw one out. You can't do modal reasoning at all. So you can't hold in mind 2 open possibilities in this way to reason over them. You can't do the representation. I'm going to argue for a linguistic story, so which is non-adult semantics. So this is basically from prior studies, there's 2 things that could be happening. One is that children may treat the modals that were tested as geontic. So they might treat them as a flavor that was not intended by the experimenter. So that is, Ozturk and Papafragou in this case are testing epistemic judgments about modals. Where is the cow? Where can it be? Where does it have to be? But actually, you could understand this as the experimenter saying what the cow is obliged to do. The cow has to be in the yellow box, and that would make you say yes, because the truth conditions change when you're thinking about an authority figure. And that's a major issue because in the input to children, has to is used over 98% of the time with root uses like that and not epistemically. That's the flavor one. I'll focus less on that, but feel free to ask. I'm going to argue for a non-adult force semantics for the modals. So another possibility is that young children don't understand that have to is a necessity modal. They understand it's modal. They don't understand that it's square, not diamond, right? So if that made sense to you. So they treat have to as a possibility modal. Indeed, languages can have a multitude of possibility modals, and I'm going to give you some arguments that necessity modals, the learning that a necessity modal is necessity, is actually quite hard from the input. Okay, so the bigger question, do preschool children know that modals like could or can express possibility, and those like have to express necessity? I've color-coded everything, by the way. Possibility is green, right, naturally, and orange is necessity. So I'll argue that they don't, that children under 5 treat necessity modals in line with their possibility modals. And so I'm arguing for a semantic word learning explanation for our results that I'll show you, as well as prior linguistic results on this. All right, a little modality primer. Might have been useful earlier, but we're going to do it now before we launch into the experiments. So modal words like can, or I'm using could and have to here, like could and have to, express possibilities and necessities. That's the force of the modal, whether they're possible or necessary, whether they express possibility or necessity, of various flavors. So we talk also about modal, lots of different kinds of modal meanings, and these can be clustered into root meanings, which have to do with priorities, so goals, rules, wants, abilities, and then epistemic meanings, which have to do with inferences from knowledge or evidence, and they are associated with the speaker making some kind of inference. So let me give you some examples. So, and these are our stimuli, which are going to be root modal stimuli, and these are Ozturk and Papafragou stimuli, which are epistemic. So cat could take the yellow road to get there, or cat has to take the yellow road to get there. So this is about her goals, or her potentially her desires as well. Epistemic, cat could be hiding in the yellow box, or cat has to be hiding in the yellow box. Here you can see it's the speaker making a judgment based on the available evidence. You may have noticed that in English, could always expresses possibility, but it can vary in what flavor it expresses possibility in, and likewise have to always expresses necessity, but it can vary in the flavor in which it expresses necessity. So I do these kind of little 2x2 boxes. I'm going to make a lot of use of these. So basically possibility, splitting it simply between possibility and necessity along the top, and then epistemic and root and epistemic along the side. And basically what I'm showing you in these little maps is how a language lexicalizes modal meanings. So in English, you have a modal like could that is always possibility, but it can vary along the flavor dimension, right? So that's that gray box. And then you have a modal like have to that always expresses necessity, but it can vary along that dimension. So this is how English behaves, and in fact it's how languages in the Indo-European family behave. Not only there are languages from other families that have this system as well, but I want to stress here that languages have all of these systems, right? So all of these modal kind of form to meaning maps exist, and it kind of shows which distinctions modal forms can cut and not cut in language. And I want to put that up here because obviously when a kid is learning their language, they don't know what language they're learning. They have to figure out what distinctions are made, right? And the most important alternative language system we have is the example I've illustrated with Giksan, which is spoken in British Columbia. And Giksan has kind of the opposite of system of English. So English has force is lexicalized, force is fixed, but flavor is variable. Giksan is the opposite. So you have an epistemic modal marker, but it can be either force, so it's force variable. So you have basically force variation, I call it force general here, but the flavor is fixed on the lexical head. This will be important. All right. So English learning children, or children learning English type languages, must work out that their input modals can express more than one flavor. That's a challenging word learning problem because we're talking about functional elements that have more than one flavor. So you've actually maybe done the word learning and you need to learn another meaning. And the syntax helps with flavor, though. Languages always have something that kind of gives away root versus epistemic uses. But you also have to learn that the force is lexically fixed. And force does not show the same nice syntactic distributional differences. The different forces don't show them. Okay, so let's first look at some production studies. So I'll look at both corpus studies of spontaneous child speech and some elicited production, and an elicited production study. This is joint work with many people: Valentin Hackar, Anouk Dioliver, Anne-Marie van Dooren, Mina Herzl, and Dunya Veselinovic. Okay, you don't have to read this table. I put it here is because we've done extensive work looking at the input to children and the productions of children in the Manchester corpus. And these are very little kids, so this is before age 3. And what we find is that before age 3, all of the modals that the parents are using in their speech with children, the children are also using. There's even one ought to, which doesn't need to be there, but there's even one ought to. They're using all of them, and we have similar data from Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian, French, Dutch, and Romanian. They're using all of these modals really early. But of course, how adult-like are they, right? So we've done various kinds of measures you can do to try to figure out if the uses of modals by 2-year-olds are adult-like. For example, some of these studies listing, we have HSP tasks, right, where you take corpus examples and you get adults to judge the uses, maybe guess whether it was a use of can or have to or might or must or what have you. Summarizing, by and large, child uses of root and epistemic modals are largely adult-like. Caveat on the epistemics that some require syntactic development that 2-year-olds don't have in order to represent. And then possibility modals also appear adult-like. And we've done more rigorous testing on this with the HSP in both English and French. When a child uses a possibility modal, they use it in contexts where adults use it and where adults judge it as appropriate to use. This is not true for necessity modals. So early uses of necessity modals, they're there, but they are less frequent than expected when we look proportionally compared to what's happening in the input, and they're not used in adult-like ways, as judged by HSP tasks. That example, this was just to show to you, kids are actually very good with modals very early. So this is an example from John from the Manchester corpus using must in his root use at 2 years, 8 months, and then the next month we have his first epistemic use of must. So showing you that they can have the same word in both flavors very young, which is an important thing for me to say because very often people have heard, if they've heard anything about modals in acquisition, it's that the epistemics are really delayed. No, when we've looked at denser corpora and less syntactically complex elements, we find that they occur from 2 years old. So it's got mud over it. I see, right, must wash it, right? So you can think of that as like an obligation to make it clean, requirement. And then later, my yellow one, cannot see it, must be gone. Here we have Violet at 3 years old saying it could be a hermit crab. She lives in Providence, so she's guessing about this shell. And then here's an example of Naima from the Providence corpus. She's barely 2 years old, like very, very young. She's looking at a book of Australian animals.
What do you see in that picture? Are there any animals in that picture?
Deer. Might be a wombat.
Might be a wombat.
Might be a cassowary.
And that other picture might be a cassowary.
Yeah. And this, I just want, like, child uses of modals are, by and large, very adult-like, except these issues we're going to see with necessity modals. But okay, corpus uses are very rich in the sense that they're coming from the child, they're in natural environments, they're supported by their environment. However, they're uncontrolled. So we don't control the context, nor do we have full access to it in many of the cases, right? So what we did, so this is work with Mina Herzl and Valentin Hackar, is we controlled the situational and grammatical contexts experimentally, and then got children and adults to produce the modal of their choosing to best describe the scenario and fit the syntactic frame we gave them. And we biased our syntactic frames heavily to a root syntactic frame versus an epistemic syntactic frame. So we asked, what modals do preschool-aged children use? when they can be confident about the context, right? And then how do those differ from what adults use in those same contexts? So again, we're using my little maps. So 2 by 2, we had both root and epistemic contexts and for flavor, and then within each we had possibility items and necessity items. So we have these 2 by 2 modal meaning space maps, we called them. So we had 38 children with a mean age of just over 4 years old and 24 adult controls. All of these people were English speakers from the Maryland area, like tested at University of Maryland. The design is we had 16 test items, so 4 per condition, right? Root, possibility, root, necessity. Blocked by flavor, where half first had the root block, and then the epistemic, and half the opposite. The procedure was that participants were trained to repeat sentences to a snail puppet, Mr. Drooly, Valentine named him. And pink noise would play over where the auxiliary would go in the target sentence. So this is a sentence repair task. It's a way to get people to produce a middle of the sentence functional element. So here's our teleological, so these are teleological root modalities, so they're goal-oriented, and we've basically rendered Papafragou and Ozturk type scenarios with 2 boxes, instead relying on roads. We have 2 open roads, and sometimes we block a road with construction. So we get the same thing, but it's about a future-oriented goal, a future-oriented modal meaning. Okay, so now Kat is going to the library to get books. There are 2 ways to get to the library. One way is to go down the yellow path. Look, or Kat go down the brown path, right? And the difference in the necessity scenarios would go, but uh-oh, it's blocked. So Kat go down the brown path. Pink path. And then Mr. Drooly would go, what? Huh? And the kid would repeat. And ideally they would repeat and repair. They did a lot of the time, not all the time. But. Our epistemic stimuli use the boxes, right? So this time there's a green box and a yellow box. So there are 2 hiding spots. And we lower the curtain. And then we say, where's Nick? One spot is the green box. Look. Or Nick be hiding in the yellow box. So crucially, we have here the difference between Kat go down the brown path, and that's an event of prejacent for the modal, versus be hiding in the yellow box, which is epistemic. Which is stative and is consistent with an epistemic interpretation. What? And we get them to repeat. Okay, here are the adult results. So the results are, so it's a possibility task. You get quite a lot of variation in what people use. So what we've done here is basically we have the exact same 2 by 2 map I keep showing you. We have root along the top, epistemic along the bottom, possibility on the left, and necessity on the right. And what we've done is when they use the possibility modal, we have them labeled as their actual use here, they're light gray. And when we use necessity, it's dark gray, and a future we put as dark, like black. So what you see with adults, the main thing you should notice is when you're in a possibility scenario, you use possibility modals. When you're in a necessity modal, you might, a necessity scenario, you might use some possibility modals. Fine, they're semantically true, but you're using necessity modals, right? So, and then for some of the modals, especially could, so especially in possibility, you're getting similar representation across both flavors. So the adult map, so the adult preferred way to divvy up the modal meaning space is the way that, not surprisingly, I used to illustrate how English semantics works, right? So same modals for possibility and necessity, but they can vary in their flavor expression. This is very different from what children do, right? So adult map, track the dark gray, child map. So children have very clear preferences by flavor. So they're using can and could, is gonna, will gonna, across teleological, and then across epistemic they're using might as the main one. Might, and then we have similar ones. There's a little bit of must here too, a little more. But basically children have preferences by flavor, but we don't really see much of the across by force using the same modals. Except, I'll give you a caveat on the second. So children basically are more likely to have the B map. And here I'm only giving you aggregate data. We also looked at all the individuals. None of the children had the same way of divvying up the space as the majority of adults. So the adults were really consistent across most speakers, and their map, the individual map, was like this too. None of the kids had a map that was consistent with the adult map when you looked at individuals. The other thing that kids are doing is sometimes using the same modal across all 4 cells. So would and could are doing that. And they're also using more future modals. So that's why I was saying their results support map B, which is like the Gixan type map, but also maybe a generalist map where you're using some modals across all of the cells. Excuse me. There's some hint with some of the children that they're starting to get that has to is good in root necessity. But that's driven by just a couple children. Okay, so summary of the corpus studies. Children produce modals in varied grammatical and situation contexts from age 2. There's quite a lot of variety in what they're doing. The full set of input modals is there by age 3, cross-linguistically. But with elicited productions for which modals they themselves prefer to use in controlled contexts, for both the major force distinction and the major flavor distinction, we see that they cut different distinctions from adults. They tend to choose distinct forms for distinct flavors. They seem to be sensitive to that contrast, right? Because they've lexically chosen to map different words to it, choose to use different words to express it. But they use both possibility and necessity modals in equal amounts across both force situations. And the way they're using necessity modals is especially odd, right? Because possibility is basically kind of okay in both. So preschoolers learning from English input, a map A language, divvy up the modal space, the modal meaning space, descriptively speaking, more like a B language at first. Development seems to involve adding epistemic meanings to more modals, right? So right now, they're not really using some of the modals like have to that can have epistemic meanings. They're not using them there. But maybe more importantly, and what we'll focus on here, is learning which modals are necessity, how to restrict them, keep them out of the possibility situations. Don't use them in the possibility situations. Okay, so moving to some comprehension studies. And this is also joint work with Valentina Kaab and Nurtier Levert, and then 2 new people, Chiara Repetti-Ludlow and Oana Lungu. So recall result 2 from the literature, right? So children over-accept necessity modals in possibility scenarios. So in a possibility scenario like this, where the question is kind of where is the cow has to be in the yellow box, they say yes about half the time, 5-year-old English learning kids. The conceptual explanation is that they understand the flavor and the force of have to. That's not questioned, not much, but cannot conceptually maintain the 2 open possibilities. So they toss one out, and then has to is true 50% of the time. But there's an issue with every prior study, which is that those studies that have been arguing for pragmatic and conceptual explanations for non-adult behaviors with modal, so with modal language, have 2 really important things in common. One is that they all tacitly assume that children know the semantic force of the modals being tested, right? So they assume kids know that can is a possibility modal, and more importantly, they assume that have to is a necessity modal. They assume that kids already know that have to is a necessity modal. That's necessary for the way they're explaining the results, right? And another very important point is they all test modal force in epistemic tasks. Let's talk about why that second one is an issue. So testing force distinctions, possibility versus necessity, in epistemic contexts may underestimate children's knowledge. It doesn't give them the best shot they potentially have to show us what they know about the force of the modals being tested. For 2 reasons. So children may face distinct or greater challenges for epistemic reasoning. Some people have argued that. I won't say too much about that now. But children also have much more input and usage experience with root modals. especially for these for the auxiliary verbs of English. So root uses of modals are at least 10 times more frequent in the children's input. So you look at must, you look at have to, you look at the whole set, you have a 10 to 1. And that's the best case scenario, so that's English. Other languages we've looked at, so I would say for Dutch it's more like 15 to 20 to 1, and for Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian is more accurate, the corpus, it's even higher than that. They're even rarer of the modal verbs. Right, and the root uses are also overrepresented to some extent for this particular syntactic category of modals in the early child usage. So this root bias could have led children to assign the wrong flavor in prior epistemic studies. So have to, for example, is root in 98% of the uses in the input, and only 2% of the time is it in its epistemic guise. It has to be true. Yeah. Also, the choices of modals people use in some of the prior studies are tricky. For example, may is, even though it's in the input, so this is the input result, may is one of the least frequent used modals, but it's used often as the epistemic example, so in Ozturk and Papafragou, for example. And then can and have to are the two, can especially, by far the most frequent modal verbs. But they're almost always root, right? So if we want to give, our reasoning was if we want to give kids the best chance of showing us whether they know the difference between possibility and necessity, can, have to, we should test them with those particular two modals in root scenarios. So testing in epistemic context may have underestimated children's knowledge of force. So we're asking, do children know that modals like have to express necessity when we test them in a root modality, giving them the best chance possible from the natural situation to show that knowledge. So here's our English forced comprehension task. So this recently came out in Dev Psych, so I'm excited about it. It's fresh. Even though we started it a long time ago, it's really not fresh. So our teleological scenarios are very similar in the recipe to Ozturk and Papafragou's experiment 1 epistemic scenarios. So we use the roads instead of boxes, right? And we set up a goal. So this is like to get to the bakery. She can take the yellow road in the possibility scenario. Or she has to take the yellow road in the necessity scenario. Or we target the blocked road, and that's our impossibility scenario. So these match the epistemic scenarios from Ozturk and Papafragou. So in our little story, we set up our goals. It's a truth value judgment task. So Kat is preparing a birthday party for Mouse. She needs to go to several shops around town to get everything she needs. Our friend Logan, a puppet who's also on screen, watches the stories with us and tells us something about each item. Sometimes Logan is silly and doesn't pay attention. So classic silly puppet truth value judgment task. So here's a sample item with have to.
Kat is going to the hat store to buy party hats for the party. There are 2 ways to get to the hat store, the orange road and the pink road.
To get to the hat store, Kat has to go down the pink road.
Is Logan right?
Okay. We wanted Logan to sound like a little dopey and be a little boy because we wanted to avoid him being like an authority, because that will, and we didn't want to do it because we were the ones who set the rules and we're older. So we wanted to make sure we were pushing teleological, goal-oriented modality consistent with our materials, as opposed to deontic, which is rules, right?
Kat?
Oops, sorry. Okay, so our stimuli and design. So we had 3 different scenarios that were tested within subjects. So we had possibility scenarios with 2 open roads, necessity scenarios where we target the unblocked road, and impossibility scenarios where we target the blocked road. The frame of the sentence was always to get to the shop, so to get to the balloon shop, Kat, modal, either can or have to, which we did between subjects, go down the yellow road. And then, is Logan right? Okay? we counterbalance the order of mention of rows, the colors, and whether the target was top or bottom of the screen. And so, right, and then we also systematically prompted 1/3 of items with how come, so after they gave their judgment, to try to get a little bit of qualitative feedback. So our predicted logical responses are identical in necessity, right? So we expect them to say, yes, yes, she can go down the yellow road, and also, yes, she has to go down the yellow road. That's consistent with what Ozturk and Papafragou found as well. In possibility, we expect them to say no in both cases. You neither can nor have to go down the impossible road. And crucially, the possibility scenarios where the predictions come apart. Cat can go down the yellow road, yes. Cat has to go down the yellow road, no. She doesn't have to. The purple road is also a possibility.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's just a methodological question, but I don't quite understand. You made a remark about this, but with that. The first voice says one thing. Second voice says something that from one read is inconsistent. And then you're asking, is the first one right? No?
Yeah, so the puppet is watching along, and the puppet says, to get to the balloon shop, Cat can go down the yellow road. And then the narrator said, is Logan right? Because this is asking the child to judge what Logan said as either true or false.
Logan's the second puppet.
Right. So now, is it a disagreement between two characters?
No. It's the puppet says something, and the child has been trained, and we have very simple items to say whether he's right or wrong about what he says. So it lets you know how the child interprets what he said.
I think the narrator doesn't use any modals. They just describe that there's a yellow road and a purple road, but doesn't use any modals. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Since you've already been interrupted, why are you doing this as between subjects?
Because we wanted to keep it relatively short. They get kind of bored. The items are very repetitive. But we wanted to make sure we tested all the scenarios within subjects. So we prioritized that. I'd be curious why. So we also did 2 other studies, which I won't spend as much time on. One where we blocked it, so they actually had can first and then have to, or vice versa. So we did that within subjects. And then we also had one with negation, which I won't talk about, but I have somewhere. Okay. I'm going to continue. Okay, so our hypotheses for the results. First is the premature closure hypothesis. So this is the one that has been most prominent in this literature, which is children have difficulty maintaining open possibilities, but they know the force of the modals tested. They reduce uncertainty by randomly eliminating one open possibility before judging the modal statement. On this hypothesis, we expect that we'll get basically the same results. We'll expect that the change into a root modality won't really help anything because they should face the same uncertainty. So we expect them to over-accept necessity modal have to in our teleological possibility scenarios at about chance, because that's what that predicts. We also expect them to over-reject possibility modal can half the time, which is not as focused on in the previous literature, but it's also a prediction, right? Because if you are tossing out one of the live possibility hiding places prior to making the linguistic judgment, then can will also be over rejected, because if you tossed out the yellow box and we said she can be in the yellow box, you're going to say no, because it's not a live possibility for you anymore. So we expect 50-50 across the board. The non-adult lexical force hypothesis basically assumes that by age 4, children are can conceptually handle open possibilities. So that's largely the finding also for the people who argue for minimal representations of possibility. Largely kids are becoming adult-like from 4. So we're thinking, okay, no, they're conceptually okay. They're conceptually okay. I can return to this issue later. But lexical issues persist. There's still word learning challenges that we are arguing particularly affect necessity modals. And that's what we saw, I think, in our illicit production task as well. So we expect them to be adult-like for can in all situations. Can not be an issue. But we expect them to over-accept have to as a possibility, and we expect it to be at ceiling, because we've removed some of the issues that affect the prior studies for what we can claim explains those 50-50 results with over-accepting necessity modals in the epistemic situations. Okay, so we tested, so on this particular test, we include 24 children, 12 per list. So half were tested on can and half were tested on have to. And then we have the also 24 adults, half on can, half on have to. Participants were included in the study only if they were willing to say both yes and no to the is Logan right prompts in our simple training items. Okay, our results. So our results, how to read these is we have child on the left, adult on the right, can, the groups tested on can across the top, and the groups tested on have to across the bottom. So adults were completely at ceiling as expected, right? So they're saying, so this is possibility. They're saying yes to can in possibility, yes to can in necessity, and no in impossibility. And with have to, they're saying no in possibility. They're saying yes in necessity, and no in impossibility. So we're getting exactly the distinction we predicted for adults. Children, over here, children behave as adults for can, like fully, right? So yes, yes, no. But for have to, their necessity, they're saying yes in necessity, no in impossibility, but they're also saying yes in possibility the vast majority of the time. And very importantly, it's not at chance. So these are not statistically different. And children are very different from adults for how they treat have to in possibility situations. Okay, when we look at individual responses, so remember we prompted them and some of the kids sometimes said useful things. So for have to in possibility, children say yes while adults say no. And so those qualitative responses that children gave often suggest they're aware of the situation. So they're considering both roads, they haven't narrowed their focus to just one, but they nonetheless say yes. So I'm just going to give you, we did this across all items, but conditions, but I'm going to give you some of the responses kids gave us when they said yes to have to in a possibility scenarios. Because they're both the same and they're both not blocked, so we don't know which one. Because there's a yellow road and a purple road. They often did that. Duh, there's two roads. Or because he has to. And sometimes they also said because he can, so they might switch the modals as well. Brief discussion of these results. So the can behavior is fully in line with adults and the logical predictions. The testing have to in an input consistent and imageable root flavor. So we have these roads. Imageable is important because deontic's really hard to do, which is probably why people have been using epistemic so much to test. Didn't ameliorate performance. If anything, it made them worse, right? Because before they were kind of like half the time seemed to be getting, but they were really at chance. And this really shows, no, they're not at chance. They're, this is, well, their non-adult behavior for have to is not random. And this test shows that pattern of results. So I think we can reject the premature closure hypothesis, right, as neither modal is at chance. And premature closure is very clear that it should be something about the scenario, the non-linguistic scenario, and committing to one of those possibilities, right? But preschoolers on our study treated have to as indistinguishably from can, unlike prior studies on epistemic modals. So the results we got are completely consistent with our non-adult lexical force hypothesis, which says that that children treat have to in line with possibility modals. We can make the stronger claim that they think it's a possibility modal. I think we need to do more work to really show that, but that's what the kind of these behavioral results are consistent with. Also take it with the elicited production task as well. And We have also run this study in French with pouvoir, which is the possibility modal, versus devoir and falloir. And we get the exact same results as English. And nicely in French, we have 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. So even the 5-year-olds are still showing this non-adult-like pattern, with a couple individual kids showing adult-like behavior. And we see that for English too. A couple of the older kids are adult-like. The neat thing we find from French that we don't get from English is French actually has, you could argue that in English, kids are getting way more experience with possibility modals. They're not hearing have to as much. You could try to come at it with a kind of a frequency explanation. They just take longer to learn what have to means. It's less frequent. However, in French, the necessity modals are actually more frequent than the possibility modals in the input. That's especially driven by falloir, faut que tu. But we found the same results, and not only that, the older kids were better with devoir, which is very rare, than they were with falloir. We also ran younger and older kids in English on a negation version, where they had can't versus can, so two puppets talking, and have to versus doesn't have to. Results are noisier, but the pattern is consistent with what we've been saying here. So a summary. So we've looked at 2 studies. So the elicited production study and the comprehension, truth value judgment task. I've also told you extremely briefly about the French task, which is the same as the English one, the English comprehension task. All of these results are consistent with a non-adult force for the necessity modals for 4- and 5-year-olds in 2 languages, both of which, so both French and English, are what we would say as A-type languages, right? Where you have the modals are fixed for their force, but they vary by flavor. So children appear to treat input necessity modals as possibility in root modality. Okay. I'm going to wrap up, but I have like 10,000 extra slides in case you have any questions about any of this. So why is necessity hard to learn? I told you it's a word learning problem, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of the word learning problem before I wrap up. Why is necessity hard to learn? So for one thing, in the majority of contexts that we are going to encounter, as long as we keep flavor constants, we're in an epistemic or a root situation, necessity entails possibility. This is the kind of classic subset issue. If a learner posits that an input modal is possibility, if they have some kind of bias to assume possibility first, they will usually be right for the situation as best as they can tell. So that will take some extra learning to learn that it's a necessity. One of the ways to get out of that problem is negation. So Gualmini and Schwartz have argued for this. I put these quotes kind of backwards. So in principle, negation should be really helpful for learning force, right? Because you can do something, and then you can't. It should flip the truth conditions. It should flip what's happening. If you know, of course, you have to know what negation is doing. But anyway, in principle, it should be really helpful. Okay. However, in the syntax, possibility modals scope uniformly below negation. This appears to be cross-linguistically true, so I'm referring to, in particular, work by Sabine Yatcherdou and Hedda Zijlstra here. But necessity modals are very idiosyncratic, even within a language. They can scope above or below, or either, depending. They can be ambiguous. So in principle, this is true, but it's less true, it's less reliable for necessity than possibility. So it's not going to help as straightforwardly. Flavor contrasts, I mentioned this a bit earlier, show up in a way where syntactic bootstrapping should be really useful. For example, epistemic uses of the same modal must, when they appear with a stative, epistemic uses are going to have a lot of things that go along with them. The kind of subject is going to be, you can get expletive subjects, they're going to have stative prejacents, so what must be true, right? Whereas with the root uses, you're going to get eventive prejacents, you must brush your teeth. And you probably feel that distinction, right? Like, must be home versus must brush his teeth. And we see that. We've looked at the corpus, looked at what cues may be there, right? And different languages have different ways of doing it. In Bosnian, the study we did, you need a biclausal construction. It must be that, right, to get the epistemic, and a monoclausal construction is fine for with an agreeing subject with the modal. The modal agrees with the subject in the root uses. So different languages are going to have different ways to do that, but we see that it's interacting with the tense aspect, modality, evidentiality system, and the subject. And we think, children rely heavily on syntactic bootstrapping for all meanings, but more so for hard meanings, hard words. Force isn't helped like this. Think about English sentences with necessity modals versus possibility modals. We don't see nice covariant cues for what the difference would be. Okay, and then the last slide. Modal systems don't always have necessity modals. So we're back to the very beginning here. I'm much more skeptical if they don't have possibility modals, given what we've seen for what appear to be child biases towards possibility. But people have also analyzed some of the languages with variable force modals as having, as being underlying underlying necessity. Yeah. When children have learned modals as possibility, maybe they assume for a while that they're done with word learning. Probably not actively, but my point is that's a perfectly viable adult linguistic system, modal system. Necessity modals are maybe not that useful. So they compete with possibility modals in many situations. They compete with plain assertions in epistemic, and I have experimental work showing kids do this way more. Kids are just like, it's raining when they have indirect evidence, where adults prefer to say it must be raining. And they compete with imperatives or generics in a lot of the root contexts, right? So I've told you how dire the situation is, right? How do we learn them then? So one possibility is that the desirability of the prejacent plays a role. This is also consistent with some work by Raisin and Aravan for quantifiers. Basically, pretty simple idea. We can do nice things, but we have to do crappy things. That is the simple idea. We've actually gone through corpus uses and had people independently just have the kind of the predicate, and is it good or bad? And some of them are things like go to the hospital, and people are like, ooh. Some of them are eat candy, right? And most of them are somewhere in between. But we do see some correlation. We do see reliable correlations there along the line, summed up here, right? And so we think kids are actually going to be in a really good position to track that, though what kids think desirable may be different from what their parents think is desirable. So there's some issues there, but we think that's a really a good way out. I'm going to end there. I have more slides for everything that are all extra slides, but you can choose your own adventure. Conclusions, I just say I think they're basically treating them as possibility until they're 5-ish. And word learning matters. Okay, thank you.
Do you want to field questions?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think Karen was first and then Paul.
Yeah, so I have just a bunch of technical questions that I wish I could spend time with you to talk about. But one thing, when you looked at the corpora, it seemed like could was much more common than can, unless I missed.
No, can is much more common in the corpora. Yeah.
It was. Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to get a piece of paper.
Couldn't quite see.
I know, that was really small corpus. Yeah.
So, the other thing is, did the kids ever, so there's all of these tense issues, right, that go along with everything. When they replace, so in the fixing experiment, did they ever, instead of just saying can or have to, say must or could have, or, you're acting like they did it right, or the way you think is right. So I guess what I'm asking about is that may give you a hint as to what they're doing. I'm very sympathetic to the whole program, but it's nothing is neat with kids.
Yes. So that study was incredibly hard to get kids to produce modals. But we managed to get an elicited production task with a functional element, midfield syntax functional element. We managed to get 3-year-olds to do it. However, with the younger group, only about 30% of the 3-year-olds were doing our task. Older kids, the results were better. However, what were they doing when they didn't do our task? So what I showed you is really the stuff that fit the syntactic frame,
Right.
because then it's comparable, and that's what adults are doing. When kids don't fit the syntactic frame, sometimes they give you something else that's like semantically good, but they change the frame. So they did use maybe sometimes in the epistemic ones, right? But then they changed the frame. So we have a section in the paper where we talk about this. They sometimes use maybe, they sometimes use think, I think, you know. So they did things that didn't maintain our syntax, but were still very good ways to describe either the goal-oriented situation or the epistemic situation. Often they would repeat the sentence and just make it work. So like cat go down, they would just cat is going down, or cat goes down. So they would make it, you know, they would just tense things. That wasn't that frequent. Usually when these little kids didn't do it, they just kind of didn't do much, right? The first experiment I ever ran was in grad school, and it was the same method with 5-year-olds. And they did really interesting things, because they would, with the epistemic scenario, they would just give you is. He is the king, instead of he must be a king, right? And my favorite thing they did is in the deontic scenario. So that one I had an actual deontic item. They would hear something like, Michelle wear ballet slippers, and it's like she has to wear ballet slippers, is what I was going for. Most kids gave me something like that, but some of the kids would just yell at the screen, go, wear ballet slippers, right? Which was like, yeah, that gets at the same thing, you just do it with an imperative, right? Which is part of why I also say imperatives compete with some of the root meanings, right? Yeah, production tasks. I think it's like super rich data, but it's of course way messier than, Paul, and then in the back.
Thanks. So I'm wondering if anybody's done an experiment where you've got the kid having to choose between puppets about who got it right. So the experimenter is putting the box behind the curtain, and nobody can see what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. So here comes Grover, and Grover thinks it's got to be in the yellow box. And now let's see if we can make both boxes, make it plausible that both boxes. So one is yellow, the other one is red but striped.
Yeah.
And now, so Grover says it's got to be in the yellow box. Here comes Kermit, who says, I don't know, Grover. Whoever's putting it into the box, Big Bird or whoever, they really like red boxes, but they also really like striped boxes.
Okay.
And so now here's Kermit saying it could be in the red box, but it could be in the striped box.
Yeah.
And then you can imagine take this one more, because here comes Cookie Monster. It has to be in the red box, and it has to be in the striped box, right? So if they really can't tell, if they're really treating has to and could effectively both in possibility modals, right? This all ought to be a chance.
Completely not possible. Yeah.
But like maybe they won't be able to track it all. But I guess the main thing I'm thinking about is like what happens if you play out for them.
Yeah.
Somebody saying, "Hang on, Grover." Fast.
Yeah.
And make both boxes really plausible candidates. Like what happens then? Yeah.
So a few thoughts on that. So first is the earliest studies looking at modals. So Hurstenweil 1982 did do kind of two puppets saying two different things, right? Like the peanut must be under the red cup and the peanut might be under the blue cup. Papafragou and Ozturk also have an experiment too that is like that. And basically the finding you get is when you give them the two modals, they're better. They're better able to pick things. But again, these are testing 4-year-olds at the youngest, I think, or we're getting results 4-year-old. Don't quote me on it for the Hurstenweil. I haven't looked at it very recently. But that's different from what you're suggesting, because you're not suggesting they say two contrasting things. You're suggesting there's a little rebuttal, right? A little.
What I'm trying to build in is like there's independent evidence that just with like negation and contrast in general.
Yeah.
Right. It really helps yank out the competence if you make both alternatives plausible
Yeah.
in the story. So that's why I was thinking it like might be important
Yeah.
to like, well, they could have put it in the red box because they really like red.
Yes.
Or they could have put it in the stripe box because they really like stripe.
You're also tapping into desirability. What is the preference of the speaker? And there is a little bit of prior work on that again by Ozturk and Papafragou Experiment 3. See, they've done everything. They've done all this stuff. Where they had like twins, and one would have a different favorite food from the other, and I think it was will versus can. You will get a broccoli versus, if I'm remembering correctly. And they found a stronger, better results or significant results, I forget how it goes, for avoiding a bad thing as opposed to getting a good thing. Yeah. But okay, so we are, Valentine, Anouk, Oana, and I are doing a follow-up in French, and I think it gets at some of what you're worried about, which is we thought our, in kind of our scenarios we've been doing here, like, there is nothing really, the drawings, I actually wish the drawings were more identical, but this one's a little squigglier. But basically what we're doing is having 3 roads, so we have multiple open possibilities. One of them is long, so we have like a long crappy road that you have 2 better options, right? But we're going to play with blocking them, and we want to try to make it, basically if you kind of have both of the short roads blocked, it's kind of like, oh damn, you have to take the long road, both the short roads. So it's kind of getting at what you're saying. But I think this is a really important thing for us to push more, because I think the fact that even the 5-year-old French children are not doing well on our task is a little worrisome. Because if you look at their natural productions, and well, actually we have done a Dooren and Novak, so Ira Novak and Anouk Dooren did do an HSP task on 5-year-old French productions from the Lyon corpus, and their possibility uses are much more accurately guessed by adults than their necessity uses, even at 5. So I don't know. But yes, I like this idea a lot, and my hunch is it would help. That we're not helping them here. Yeah, adults can do this, but of course, yeah. And I think they know more than we're saying. Even though I'm giving you the word learning story, I feel like it's probably more nuanced. They probably do know more than we're giving them credit here. I just want to keep it simple. Yeah. There was one in the back. Yeah.
Yeah. When we talked about the child who they were prompted to say something like someone has to wear ballet slippers, but then they just said
wear ballet slippers.
Wear ballet
yeah.
slippers. Kind of made me think, and I'm not an expert on this, but like, don't children also have difficulty with like verbs like have or have to, at least in English, where they just like instead of saying give me a hug, they just say hug me.
Oh.
That has something to do with that. And I was even thinking of that too, you know, between having the English have to, which we could like for, whereas in French, I don't think you have more falloir verbs.
No, they're verbier. They're still verbier, I should say. Yeah, so the issues children have with light verb and production should, again, if I'm remembering correctly, resolves earlier than what we're seeing here. So yes, they do things, and but I think that, but you bring up a bigger issue, which is have does a lot of work in English, and it's all pretty abstract, tricky work, functional work, right? And that could be challenging. But again, yeah, I think our French results help a lot there, where devoir and falloir don't. Falloir is weird in other ways if you know French. But I actually think those are ways that should help you learn its meaning. Yeah.
So, I mean, since you brought up...
Oh, sorry, I think there was more questions. Okay, let's go. We started.
Okay. Since you brought up have.
Yeah.
Have to is very different than must. And that have to has all kinds of syntactic restrictions on it that must doesn't, and vice versa. So, and plus there's just have as possession.
Yeah.
And prosody can influence the various interpretations of these things. So it seems like a cleaner, I understand that have to is a lot more common in the input than must, but the doing can versus have to seems to me like not the
There's,
cleanest comparison. I understand it's.
We had to make a choice, so we prioritized one thing over the other.
Right, but it's, and I'm also worried about the could have. So I could have gone, right, could have gone that way, but you can't do I can have, right? So there's all of these really, I mean, the last thing I was going to say is, you said, why aren't kids adult-like? And I am not convinced that adults are adult-like. So just putting it out there, maybe the students are all trying to pull it. I said you had to. It's different meaning of the word had to. So I'm a little bit queasy by the use of have to.
So yeah, we definitely had reasons for choosing have to. But must and can have more similar distributions and are kind of the same set. The issue is must do is much rarer. That said, I think it's a really good choice for an epistemic when you're testing epistemics, but we weren't, right? We were. If you want to choose epistemics, choose might and must. That's what Moscati et al. 2017 did, but their task is more complicated. Their task is tricky. However, they have eye tracking data with 5-year-olds, 5-year-old Australian English children, like you were maybe. And those are well-chosen modals for an epistemic paradigm, which is not true of most of the other studies. They can be epistemic, but it's not as well. And the eye tracking data shows the adult-like pattern, so they distinguish, which is nice. Yeah, in the back. I think it was you, and then Amrit. Yeah. Oh yeah, left to right.
I was raised right.
Well, then we're skipping you.
I'd like to do one of the Choose Your Own Adventures. I saw you had a slide with commentary about Brian's
yes.
Little possibilities.
Yes, I do. Choose Your Own Adventure. How much time do I have there? When are we go to? We've been talking for a while.
Like 25 minutes.
Oh, okay. It won't take that long. All right, so we developed our study before this paper came out, which is a fresh paper. It was one of these pandemic adult experiments where we did different versions. So we developed it, and we developed it very much as premature closure, like Ozturk and Papafragou and Moscati and all also argue that for their behavioral data, versus our thought that, okay, maybe it's the semantics. Let's question the semantics. But in 2020, Leahy and Carey published about minimal representations of possibilities, which some of you may know. And then in 2022, officially maybe, Leahy and Zalnourianis did a study with can and have to. And what they were doing is using Y-shaped slides with future outcomes of a ball dropping event, right? So this is the Redshaw and Suddendorf 2016 kind of paper, which is like you have a ball dropping event, and if it splits in two and you want to catch the ball, put your hand under both exits, right? But what little kids do is this, right? With all the ball dropping, they just keep covering one exit. So that's the results from the 2016 paper. They're basically doing the same thing with these, this was done online, and they have these kind of like representations of it, right? And they use the same modals, can and have to, and they say, can it come out here, can it come out here, can it come out here? And of course, if you're dropping it here, it can't come out here. So they ask the kids all these questions. And then they also did a non-linguistic task with putting the little bucket, placing the bucket to catch the ball, right? Right. Okay. They use the same modals as us, and they get very similar result patterns as us. Their story is very different from ours, okay? So their story is that children under 4, and many over 4, so things resolve kind of gradually, but let's say that's kind of where most kids start resolving, can't do adult modal representations of possibility. So they can't postulate two crucially kind of incompatible worlds, like it's raining, it's not raining, at the same time, and just treat them both as possible. That's modal reasoning, a modal reasoning ability. Instead, they argue that children under 4 have what they call minimal representations of possibility. So these are non-modal. They were a kind of possibility, but it's basically just a simulation. It's like a guess, right? different ways of rendering that as they've worked on these projects. So a guess that as soon as you guess it, you treat it as actual. So in the Redshaw and Suddendorf, if you drop the ball, you just simulate one of the exits, and you decide that's the actual, that's going to be the actual outcome. So whoop, put your hand under one, and you won't be able to do the. I do this in the front of rooms often. So what happens then? So their results are the same and really similar to ours, right? With the language task. So the results with possibility modals, they argue, are surface adult-like, right? So they're kind of accidentally correct, because if you have a minimal representation of possibility, somehow as the meaning as the semantics for can, you're going to be right about what can happen where, because you're just going to run each simulation, right? But because you only have a minimal representation of possibility, you actually can't even do a possibility necessity distinction. You need modal possibility there to kind of rule out worlds and do the necessity strengthening. So their have-to results are just like ours. They're in line with their can, but they argue that's because they only have minimal representations of possibility. So they can't have a possibility versus necessity distinction conceptually, right? Okay. They argue that children use a simple strategy to evaluate possible P or not, so making that guess. This also captures our results, right? However, the timeline's a little trickier. Over-accepting necessity and possibility for our 4-year-olds is pretty consistent with their story, because a lot of 4-year-olds haven't yet advanced to modal representations of possibility, as measured by the non-linguistic tasks, right? Behaviors on the non-linguistic tasks, very importantly. But our French data, especially with 5-year-olds, is getting less well covered by this conceptual approach, because they're still treating devoir and falloir, with the exception of some kids, in line with pouvoir. So the necessity model is in line with the possibility. And they're 5. And at this point, and there's too many of them doing it for matching with the advancing to modal representations. Now, a combination theory works, right? So you could have both a minimal representations of possibility approach that would allow you to capture the results with non-linguistic tasks, and persistent word learning challenges. In fact, I think if you're committed to minimal representations of possibility, then you actually have to also be committed to our account, because it would necessarily feed possibility-only semantics for all the modals, right? So somehow kids are using these modals, and they're using them well from age 2, right? So on their story, I think you have to say that they have some possibility semantics for them. It's just not a modal possibility, yeah? But they have that for all the modals then. And then you still basically have to figure out that have to is necessity once you've graduated into modal. So I think you still need, I think their account would feed. I think they'd have to be committed to the word learning account as well. But we wouldn't. It could be all word learning. To explain the linguistic results, I think it could be all word learning. Notice our account also explains the failure to generate scalar implicatures, because you don't have scale mates. If you have can and have to as both possibility modals, you don't have a stronger alternative. So you also don't generate a scale mate. So we think it captures all the linguistic stuff. It does not capture the non-linguistic tasks, and I don't know what to do with those. So that's where we're at. We were like, we're learning, but yeah, we can't explain the non-linguistic tasks.
Has anyone looked at so their prediction is 5-year-olds can do their Y ball dropping task.
Yeah.
And then you guys are finding, because of maybe language specific effects, French 5-year-olds can't do the linguistic tasks.
Yeah.
So it seems like 5-year-old French kids.
So I think the 5-year-old English kids are probably consistent, where in both cases both can do it. But in the paper I talked about, the English paper, we tested 5-year-olds only on the negation task. We don't have the simple task with 5-year-olds. We should still maybe do that.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
yeah. So we have better data from the French kids right now. And especially we also have the corpus data with the HSP that Anouk and Ira Novik have done. So yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. That was basically my question.
Well, okay.
So may I add? So this is super interesting. There's also, you mentioned that maybe I don't know what to do with the non-linguistic failures.
Yeah.
There's at least one study that I know of from Esra Küçük
and Kibi,
that does a recognition of an actor either covers both exists versus one, and 3-year-olds choose the actor as using a better strategy that covers both exists. So it may be the case, I guess, for that could feed into word learning, right? Rather than this conceptual deficit underneath, they're just trying to still map.
Yeah.
And then also producing the behavior themselves.
Yeah, that paper's super interesting. Sorry, I cut you off for a second. That paper's super interesting because they basically say the issue is a planning issue and kind of a understanding what the nature of the task is and how you can solve it as opposed to a conceptual one. But Brian Leahy has a later study where he kind of controls for that and complexifies it a little, and then he still gets the results where they are not so good at it. So there's been back and forth on that, right? But there's also other work out of Melissa Kibbe's lab, same authors, with the kind of locations versus identities or objects, right? And the idea is maybe possibility reasoning, how we're defining it is smushy here, but might come online in different domains at different times, right? And might initially kind of piggyback on the vision system and object tracking, and so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there.
And that will make it worse for the word learning problem, right?
I think the word learning problem just is still there, no matter how rich you make the conceptual abilities. Obviously there should be interactions, but the word learning problem should always be there, I think. Word learning's hard with these words. They're not nouns. And nouns are harder than they seem to, but they're,
class, just a question about you just talked about it, but you didn't go into it. The French learning kids, the input in French, having more necessity modals.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure if I quite followed. Well, I'm sure I didn't follow.
Yeah.
Could you just explain that in the context of the input-driven theory? Because it seems to me on the surface maybe evidence that it's something not linguistic, right? If they're getting a lot of necessity modals in the input, but they're still having this incorrect usage.
Yeah. So. One of the things we wanted to just show with French is that, which is kind of confounded in English, is it's not just a matter of there being far more possibility than necessity. So you just have less experience, less examples, and so the French we kind of get the reverse. So we basically wanted to rule that out because our suspicion was it was a deeper explanation. Either conceptual or word learning or both, right? But kind of rule out the more surfacey issue. So here's the input. So this is from Zuliver and Novik, 2023. So English, these are just representative, right? Basically, the input to kids in English, the proportion is 72% possibility modals, 28% necessity, and in French we have 38% possibility, and that's all pouvoir, and then 62% necessity. So in French, necessity modals are more frequent than possibility modals, but kind of more importantly than that, or for what we tested and what we cared about, is that among the necessity modals, falloir is really, really frequent, and devoir is actually still pretty infrequent. So in a way, devoir is behaving, and also in kind of raw proportions out of the utterances, behaving more like each of the modals in English. A little less than have to, but whereas falloir is a different kind of beast. So we could also compare the two necessity modals. It being natural language, natural data, these are not identical beasts. Devoir is a pretty normal verby thing. Some people say it's like an auxiliary, but it's like verb. It's not like the English auxiliaries. It shows agreement and all that.
But falloir is always has an expletive sub il faut que, and it's in this particular fixed expression. So it's got other weirdnesses, but basically,
that's the difference, proportionally speaking, and we found the same experimental results. So, yeah.
Right, so does that not suggest that it's not just word learning here? Or do you think the transparency of the meaning is still an issue? I mean, the kids get more examples, right?
Well, I think for this kind of word learning, just more of something doesn't necessarily help. It's it's what you've already learned, and like how well you can use things like, hold on. Well, I still think that's true, but I think it's an issue for our desirability adjacent thing, right? Because that should still tell you falloir is necessity. You faux do bad things.
Right.
Sorry, undesirable things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, it's a real issue. Yeah. Yeah.
Assuming parents are using it that way as well, right?
Yeah, that's the thing.
But I guess probably like.
There's more to do here for sure. But yeah, basically, okay. So the reason, the kind of reasons I went over for why necessity modals are hard are going to be pretty. I talked about them on a high level, right? But then I want to think about actually how does faux interact with negation, and is it pretty consistent, and can that be learned quickly or not? So I kind of want to dig into each of those potential factors and see how they play out in each language, because any of those kind of issues may not be an issue in some languages, or maybe more of an issue in some languages than others, or the desirability of the adjacent should play out either way to give you. Yeah, but I think this is a real issue. Why aren't the French kids maybe faster?
Yeah.
If they're getting more examples to help them. Yeah. But I was worried about frequency. Frequency of what? Frequency what? How can you use it, right? It's just such a, yeah. By itself, I don't find it explanatory. I find it just a factor, and then you need to say more.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know what to say. Yeah.
I have a question that Paul's question made me think of.
Yeah.
Which is all of the tasks, and I think this is maybe also true about Brian's, but I think all the ones you presented today.
Yeah.
There's two possibilities on the table, right? Like two roads. But the question is always about one.
Yeah.
Right? So the phrase is always, she can take the yellow road,
yeah.
She has to take the yellow road, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've tried having the phrase be about both.
Yeah.
Where you say, she can take the yellow road and she can take the, I don't know, take the purple road. Yeah, this is maybe a problem.
Or introduce another. Yes. But and would be okay. I think we can do it.
Versus has to take the yellow road and has to take the
purple
road, right? Where if has to really means can, then both of those should be fine for a kid.
Yeah, that's a really good.
But for an adult, of course, they wouldn't. Both things can't be true at the same time.
I was thinking the same thing about is it a grouping issue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you tried that? Has anyone tried that? Do you have thoughts about how that would go?
We haven't tried that. I think it's a great idea. I think the closest we've gotten is kind of what Leahy and Zalnariunas do, which is kind of come out here, kind of come here. But those are all separate questions, so it doesn't get at what you're saying. Yeah. No, we've stuck to this. Or we've had two separate speakers do the different. Yeah, but then they use different modals. You want same modal.
Same modal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea.
I'm wondering if this might help you differentiate. I haven't thought through all of the logic, but I'm wondering if this would help differentiate the simulation account versus the means the same thing as can account.
Yeah.
Because a simulation, you still can't maintain, two things can't be true at the same time if you're taking just the result of simulations.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. Although they say you can have parallel simulations. But yeah. So there's also been when you do a little follow-up and you say, can it only come out here? Which kind of gets at it, but again, in not as simple a way as you. And then I'm like, do they understand only? Yeah.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Ailis.
Thank you.
please join us at the reception, A139.